ships in the South China Sea. You have Chinese warships in the Indian Ocean. There's because of military technology and their churning economies, these two demographic behemoths find that their spheres of influence increasingly overlap. As I say this, keep in mind, while India's growth has de-hyphenated it from Pakistan and hyphenated it with China so that we less and less compare India with Pakistan and more compare India with China, India is still not nearly on the same level of development as China. The goal of our foreign policy is always to spread liberal democracy and capitalism. This former Soviet Union had a missionary foreign policy, spreading communism. China does not have a missionary foreign policy. China's foreign policy is driven by the need to acquire large stores of natural gas, oil, strategic minerals, and strategic metals in order to raise the living standard dramatically of 1/5 of humanity. China's leaders want to raise hundreds of millions of Chinese into the middle class. And to do that, it will need tremendous amounts of natural resources. And that's why it's going everywhere in search of it, from Africa to Central Asia to the Middle East, from off the coast of Burma, bringing this oil and natural gas, and coal and other things into. And this world, this Indian Ocean maritime world, factors in Central Asia even. While we Americans continue to ask ourselves, how can we leave Afghanistan? The Chinese are asking themselves, how can we stay in Afghanistan? China is already prospecting for copper in Afghanistan, protected by American troops. China has its eye on the $1 trillion worth of minerals and metals under the surface of Afghanistan. Were the United States to semi-stabilize Afghanistan and further stabilize Pakistan, this would be a big strategic victory for the Chinese, because it would allow China to continue to build what it's already started, a road and pipeline and rail network throughout Central Asia, parts of the Middle East, leading directly into China, bringing all sorts of natural resources. So this is, so think of a world a few decades hence where you have roads and pipelines linking Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran with ports on the Indian Ocean that will then load onto ships crossing the Indian Ocean, or going the other way with ships depositing oil and natural gas moved up through roads and pipelines and then transported across into Western China. Now, what are we talking about here? We're talking about that the sum total effect of the Afghanistan wars, whatever you think of those wars, has been to fast forward the arrival of the Asian century. And by Asian, I mean South Asian and East Asian both, one organic Eurasia. And I mean this not just in an economic sense, because after all, East Asia has been rising economically since the late 1970s. There were cover stories over 30 years ago in Forbes and Fortune magazine about the rise of the Pacific Tiger economies. I mean the rise of the Asian century in the military sense as well. In a military sense as well. It's not just China's military. India's navy is on its way to becoming the third largest navy in the world. Japan, supposedly quasi-pacifistic Japan, which devotes only 1.5% of its military of its GDP to defense, has 123 warships of the highest quality. You have, well, let me put it this way. At the start of the Cold War, at the end of World War II, When you looked at Asian militaries, India's, China's, others, they were basically unsophisticated, very large land armies, which were good for bringing in the crop, for building roads, for basically inculcating the sense of nationhood. They were vehicles for developing a nationalistic mentality, and they were focused inward on the nation itself, so that at the end of World War II, through the Cold War, the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean were veritable American lakes. That is slowly starting to change. As these other navies and air forces get stronger and stronger, and our Navy, which was about 580 warships during the Reagan era, went down to about 350 warships during the Clinton era, and is now down to about 286 warships. And according to the Congressional Budget Office and other studies, may drop into the mid-200s, is in relative terms getting smaller. Let me take up the last part of my address with three examples of this new world that we're entering, that is beyond Iraq, beyond Afghanistan. Let me talk for a minute about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is not important for Americans, at least they don't think it is. Sri Lanka had a 25-year-long civil war between the Sinhalese Buddhist government in Colombo, relatively in the south, and the ethnic Hindu Tamils in the north. The civil war ended abruptly, suddenly, decisively in May 2009 and received almost no coverage in the American media. But it was very important for this new world we're entering. Sri Lanka sits astride the major sea lines of communication, where tens of thousands of major ships pass by each year. I was in Sri Lanka when the war ended. In fact, I was arrested in Sri Lanka and spent a night in a prison because I had trespassed onto the harbor facility that the Chinese were building, and I was caught. And what the Chinese are building is immense. It was the most immense construction site I had ever built. There are literally long lines as far as the eye can see of dump trucks transporting soil and switchback trails from the bottom of this massive pit to the top. The Chinese are doing nothing less than moving the coast inland several hundred miles in this massive port complex that they're building. What you probably didn't read about was that, in fact, indirectly, the Chinese won the Sri Lankan Civil War. The United States and other Western powers denied almost totally the Sri Lankan government aid, military support, because of human rights violations. China moved in. China moved in with everything from knockoffs of AK-47 assault rifles for roadblocks to boats, to planes, to everything they could provide the Sri Lankan government, as well as diplomatic protection at the United Nations. Of course, China, as I said earlier, is not going to build a naval base, is not going to have a naval base in Sri Lanka, because that would be too provocative to India. So that China is, China will play a great game of sorts with India in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, for influence and strategic position. In a way, it's very good for the United States that India is involved in Burma, because that way there can be one balancing power, essentially indirectly protecting interests in Burma. And so a country like Sri Lanka becomes incredibly important in this new world, where you have India and China against each other, and where the United States is more indispensable than ever, because we're the only Asian power that doesn't have territorial pretensions on the mainland. So that The United States, essentially needs to leverage like-minded democratic others in India, in Indonesia, in South Korea and Japan. Finally, let me talk a bit about the South China Sea. As I said before, Vietnam, which dominates the western boundary of the South China Sea, is emerging as one of the surest American allies in all of Eurasia, precisely because Vietnam defeated the United States in a war. It has no chips on its shoulders, no axes to grind, no grudges to bear, no face to lose, by openly entering into a military alliance of sort with the United States without needing to make explanations or apologies to its neighbors. And Vietnam greatly fears China. Vietnam, Indonesia, other countries in East Asia all have China as their largest trading partner, and therefore they require the United States as a kind of hedging power, as a balancer, against China. Indonesia has only 2 submarines. China has many dozens. Indonesia requires the presence of the United States Navy to balance against China. But Indonesia cannot say this publicly because Indonesia would be afraid to alienate others in the Islamic world. Remember, Indonesia is 240 million people, 200 million of which are Muslim, the largest Muslim society on earth.
That was driven by communism. You don't mention China in the context of its communism. Is there a dynamic apart from its willingness to find raw materials to feed its own people? Does it have perhaps an ambition similar to the Russians that embodies communism as a threat to the rest of the world? Or is that dead?
The Chinese regime is nominally communist, but it's functionally very vigorously capitalist. It doesn't really have a motivating ideology. I think of 2 things when I think of China in this regard. One is that China's current borders more or less mirror China at the apex of its imperial ambitions. In other words, our present borders encompass most of previous Chinese empires. Yes, Mongolia, which is independent, used to be part of the Manchu Qing dynasty, and some other areas that were part of previous dynasties are not part of China. But at the same time, China still has in its relatively recent memory, in the 19th and early 20th century, the terrible experience of having their territory violated by Western nations through the treaty system, the extraterritoriality system, and where Chinese cities were in fact controlled by Western nations, where the Japanese had taken the Shandong Peninsula, made a puppet state in Manchuria, where the Russians controlled the rail link across Manchuria. So China is very nervous about sovereignty. At the same time, its map is very, very big.
हमारा ये वीडियो कैसा लगा, ये बात हमको कमेंट के जरिए बताते रहें। हमारी चैनल को लाइक करें, शेयर करें और सब्सक्राइब करना